Okay, we've talked about culture and culture being relative to the global world. So here, I think it's important to jump back to the discussion of ethnicity and ethnocentrism. So what are we talking about when we're talking about ethnicity? And we've defined this before. Cultural tradition. We lump them together. Ethnicity, in its definition, actually doesn't have anything to do with race. There's nothing here that says you have to share a racial background, right? And again, if you go back to what we discussed when we covered race, the idea of race is socially constructed in the first place. And so when we talk about an ethnic group, of course, these cultures might still be understood to but a lot of that today. But it's a sense of taken for granted cultural superiority, right? To go back to this fish, a good example, I think, is we use forks, knives, spoons most frequently. In my life with my white friends in particular. Hard. It's really but first of all, when you take it back a few chopsticks, then you, my friend who grew up eating Chinese food at the mall, you know what I mean? It's sort of like, yeah, obviously there's going to be this different kind of socialization pattern there that just makes the tool itself much more useful to people who have actually learned the mechanism behind it. But also, it's embedded with these ethnocentric ideas that what I've grown up with is just so apparently better, and everybody else should do things the way that we do things. But it doesn't take into account the reason why those tools developed in the first place. Again, when you're thinking about the text that you have at hand, and I don't know the history of chopsticks. I also don't know the fork and spoon. This would be really fascinating. So if anybody knows this, let me know. But now I'm like, I want to see if there's a podcast about this. But anyway, yeah, they developed out of a need, right? And out of probably the kinds of food that people were eating. And so those were the best tools to eat kinds of food. And also cultural practices in terms of how we actually eat. And so, if you're using chopsticks, you can very quickly get a lot of food into your mouth, right? And that's sort of a cultural practice in terms of with a fork and knife, right? Maybe you can. that sounds very American. It's like a steak on your plate. So yeah, again, it's how we eat, what we eat, and again, the most effective tools. So it's ethnocentric to say, and I would also bring up this modern example with also racism. You know, again, these two things combine, but the way that President Trump has referred to coronavirus as what is he calling it? He's the China disease, or I can't remember actually what he's even saying because it's ridiculous. But um, he's doing this very ethnocentric and racist thing and xenophobic thing, right? Where he's just trying to say, like, oh, we as Americans, we didn't think mentality that just fosters all of this kind of hatred and bigotry between groups, to call it the China virus or whatever it is that he's saying, right, is pretty ethnocentric because it implies this cultural superiority that Americans are not at risk. And very much are at risk. And he continues to be wrong about this. But he's political here. He's trying to create this groupthink. He's trying to create this divisiveness. So Americans can continue to feel like, okay, but at least we're not responsible. At least we're still this cream of the crop, you know, best country in the world, where at least we didn't start this. When in fact, you look at the science behind this, and you guys have probably read, you know, a bunch of different things, but obviously this disease was bound to spread across the world regardless. So anyway, just sort of another example, a little bit tangential, but I think it's important to consider right now. Okay, so when we think about ethnocentrism, it's sort of interesting. It's typically a negatively connotated term, and I think for good reason, because of what we just talked about, the hatred, the bigotry, the groupthink, all of that stuff, the us versus them mentality that's perpetuated. You know, that doesn't being diverse when groups of people hate each other. But in pros, there, maybe not even pros, but like there are some good things that are surprising that can be associated with ethnocentrism. And I'm definitely not one to say that that means that ethnocentrism is something that we should all strive for. But from a theoretical standpoint, I just want to challenge you to think about, like, what could be a positive outcome of people having this kind of groupthink mentality. A couple good things are that it does enhance social solidarity. So unfortunately, mentality that other group is foreign, is scary, but it can bring you together with that group around, like make you say something like, okay, obviously we as Americans, we do this thing better, or we do this thing differently. You see your fellow country people as somehow close to you. So also promotes patriotism and pride in your country. That can be a good thing. It can also be good for people's mental health in some ways. So it can also encourage us to help others. I think, again, going back to this quarantine example, we've seen so much giving right now. So when the coronavirus came to the United States, People are donating to different organizations to help fight against interpersonal violence, to help fight against poverty. So we're sort of giving more in tips to servers and people in the restaurant industry. So we're being very helpful right now, but it's only to our own, right? It's only to Americans. And this example is particularly striking because we weren't doing this when the disease was abundant in Wuhan, China, right? Like we weren't sending money in the form of donations, or we weren't helping in the same way when it was people who we didn't think of as sort of one of us, right? Because of these national borders that have developed, we have this idea that, but okay, once it's affecting us, we are going to help. Again, yeah, this one falls in the pros and cons, right? Because the last point here in cons, it can discourage us from helping others from different cultures. So even though we can be very helpful to people we see as our neighbors, we can be especially unhelpful to people who we don't see as deserving or right, or as one of us. And so I think, of course, with ethnocentrism, the cons very, very largely outweigh the pros. But again, I just wanted to challenge you from a theoretical standpoint to think about what could be some of the positive reasons why ethnocentrism exists. I think another big con is that it can actually prohibit social change or progress. Not getting that diverse thought. If we're only thinking in the same way of our own traditions, our own rituals and values, there's nothing new being added. There's no element that creates a spark that says, hey, what if we tried this in this way? And so we can get kind of like caught in a rut, making the same thing over and over again. I think that there's really something to be said about just blending ideas and blending people, and diversity has so many merits. And of course, I stand on that side of things, that I believe in the power of diversity, because I do think that it can really help bring about social change. And I also think that it can help to dismantle this ethnocentrism and this xenophobia that we see. But yeah, it's just something that is important to think about, is important to consider when we're talking about culture and cultural practices.